Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Savor, Food, and Body. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about mental health, which is so important for women in midlife. And my guest is therapist Monica DiCristina. And Monica is a licensed professional counselor with more than a decade of experience in individuals and couples therapy. She walks with people as they process difficult experiences, helping to bring healing to their relationship with themselves and others. Monica has studied and been trained in attachment therapy, emotionally focused couples therapy, and restoration therapy. She brings a commitment to clinical excellence and continual training to her practice. It's Monica's wholehearted belief that everyone is worthy of becoming emotionally free, and that individuals of every age, race, background, and belief system should have the access and opportunity to pursue health and wholeness. Through her podcast, Still Becoming, as well as her writing, speaking, and counseling work, Monica carries out her heartfelt mission to guide and collaborate with others in their process of becoming who they were meant to be. And that word becoming, you're going to hear us say that a lot today because we are going to be diving into what does it mean to be becoming and what does it mean to be becoming, particularly for women in midlife. Like, this is an unraveling time. This is an unbecoming and then becoming. And so Monica and I are going to dive into all of that today. So Monica, thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. And I'm so excited for our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited too. I'm excited to be here.
So let's just start off with telling us a bit about the work you do and what inspired you to help people kind of foster this healthier relationship with themselves and others. I know it's a really big question, but let's just start our conversation with that one.
Yeah, it's a big question, but it's a great question. I mean, I'm a practicing therapist. I have my own private practice in Atlanta, and I see adult individuals and couples. I would say the vast majority of my individual clients are women. Why I began this work was through my own journey. You know, I really struggled until I found a therapist in my early 20s, and everything started to make sense. Everything that didn't make sense made sense for me internally. And I thought if I could do anything in my life professionally, it would be to do this work, to create safe space for people, to help them understand how they make sense, to help them become more free to be who they've always been or return to who they always were. That's a big, that my own journey really drove my passion for this work. And then being with the amazing clients I get to be with continues my passion for it.
I think that many of us get into this counseling work, whether we're counseling mental health or we're counseling food, as it is for me, because we have our own story wrapped up in there somewhere too, which I think, has two sides to it. One, it helps us to really feel that empathy with what our clients are going through. And at the same time, it really pushes us to understand about transference and not to transfer our stuff onto other people, and to go and get maybe the training of areas that maybe we thought we needed help at the time and it wasn't there, it wasn't available, or what we got was okay and it helped at the time, but we want to do better for our clients. So,
so well said. I love that. Yes, absolutely.
So when you're working with folks, what do you see are some of the main barriers that are holding people, especially women in midlife, from finding that freedom of who they were meant to be?
Gosh, so many things. I think that one of the things that comes to mind today are old narratives, old scripts, that we often carry around old narratives, whether they are narratives that we came up with ourselves or narratives that were assigned to us by other people, or a combination of the two, us making a narrative from painful experiences. I think that we often hold to those, even if they are not loving or kind or true, because they're familiar, and it's hard to imagine something different than that. So I think that's one of the main things that I find over and over again impacts that.
And walk us through just a little bit of your process. Like, how do you work with helping someone identify a narrative or unpack that narrative? Because I see this a lot in my work too.
Yeah, I think that the sort of stereotypical thing about therapists wanting to know about your childhood is true, and I like to think of your childhood like your marinade. And I don't know if I came up with this or if I read this 20 years ago. I don't know, but that's how I always refer to it. It's like your marinade. You take on things, whether you want to or not. And so we kind of look at, okay, what happened, and we start to validate what happened. Because that's one thing that's often missed is that stories are passed over, not validated. And then we start to unpack it, right? Okay, so this happened. What belief did you begin to conclude about yourself or about relationships or about your safety in the world? Because we're often concluding one of those things from our experiences growing up. So that's some of the main ways we start to sort of, sift through. I like to think of it like sifting and sorting. Like, what do we want to keep? What do we want to leave behind? What's working for you? What was never true about you, but you've had to feel and live as if it was?
I love that analogy of the marinade. I might need to borrow that, of course, with credit
Yes,
to you,
please
but
do. Well, I don't know who to credit it. I've been saying it for 20 years, but you read so many books that I don't want to take credit for it just in case it wasn't mine, in case I read it somewhere. But it's applicable, right? For our experiences.
absolutely. And since I'm the food person, just as you were describing all of that, I'm thinking
Hmm.
of the recipe of a marinade.
Yeah.
And like there's this
Yes.
ingredient, there's this
So
ingredient, and
true.
there's this
Hmm.
ingredient. And so,
Yeah.
as you're unpacking it, even from that
Yep.
analogy standpoint, we can
Hmm.
ask someone like, so why did you put garlic in here? Where did you learn to put
Right.
garlic in this
Uh-huh.
marinade?
Yeah.
Where did you learn
Yes.
to put this
Right.
body shame in at this age?
Hmm.
Where
Yeah, totally.
where
Or
did
who
that
told you you
come?
needed garlic? Right? I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
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 Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
The Savor Food and Body, like bells and whistles are just going off for
Yay,
me with
yay,
that.
good. I love that.
That's a
Good.
great. And you're right. We do, I like how you said too, is that we often pass over our stories.
We do.
And
Yes.
when I'm
Mm-hmm.
working with folks, and a Savor is an acronym for kind of the process that
Hmm.
I work with
Oh,
folks
great.
through. And this
Mm-hmm.
idea of this awareness of it kind of goes to like, we have to be aware of our story. We have to be aware that you have a story and
Yeah.
kind of just bring it up
Love
to the
it.
surface and saying,
Mm-hmm.
hey, like this is part of who you are. This is the
Mm-hmm.
marinating, this is the seasoning, this is what brought you into this. And
Mm-hmm.
you can choose to believe some of it. We can
Mm-hmm.
choose to reframe some of it. Like, what do you want to
Mm-hmm.
do with the
Mm-hmm.
marinade that you had? So
Mm.
I love all
Love
of that. These
that.
are so helpful.
Yeah. That awareness is just crucial. Yep. I couldn't agree more.
We can't unpack what we don't know or what we don't
Exactly. Yeah.
recognize.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
So,
Absolutely.
so then when it comes to this term emotionally free, what does that
Mm-hmm.
mean to you, and how do you help your
Mm.
clients work towards that emotional freedom? And I'm also
Yeah.
wondering how this might relate to someone's body story and body image. We could dish on that a little
Mm-hmm.
bit.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think of emotionally free, I think of, we probably all have different ideas what that looks like. But what I think of is the freedom to be congruent with yourself, right? For your insides to actually match what you're saying and doing on the outside. Because oftentimes we're taught to do the opposite. I think of emotionally free, where you being free to say yes and to say no when it's actually accurate for you. For you to feel free to, everyone says to be yourself, but, to actually feel like yourself as you walk around in your own body and in your own life and in your own relationships. Because so often we're playing a role, we're playing a script because that's what we learn to do to receive love. And so emotionally free is I'm worthy today, right now, in this body as I am, and I get to be free with that. That doesn't mean careless, but that means to be able to do things that are actually authentic to who you are.
One, as you're saying that, one of the things that's coming up from another interview that I did with Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Alexandra Stockwell, and she's known as the intimacy doctor. And so we were talking about
Mm-hmm.
emotional intimacy and then how
Mm-hmm.
that translates into our intimate relationships. And
Yeah.
she had this phrase that was almost kind of like a mic dropping phrase of like, in
Mm-hmm.
order to have that emotional intimacy, and,
Yes.
excellent physical connection, we have to stop compromising, which is
Mm.
exact opposite of,
Mm-hmm.
again, there's a narrative that I was taught, and
Totally.
that compromising is like the base of a relationship. But to your
Yeah.
point too, of this being free is
Mm-hmm.
also, as you were describing, that sounds like it has a level of uncompromising. Doesn't mean we're ever always going
Yeah.
to get our way, but we're
Right. Right.
uncompromising with
Right.
who we are. Does that feel
Yes.
relevant?
It feels very relevant. And a word that I would use, that I often use in therapy, is editing, right? We
Mm.
over edit ourselves. We edit ourselves down to the place where we're barely still in the room. We're barely still in the conversation or in the relationship, And so I think we're sort of saying the same thing here, that sometimes we do that to a point where we don't show up like a whole person. It's hard to be physically, emotionally intimate with someone when you're not behaving as your whole person, or someone else isn't there as a whole person. That's one of the unintended consequences of us trying to please people, is that we often don't feel known or loved because we're not showing up as ourselves, right? And there's obviously always reasons why we end up that way, but it's really hard to feel close when you're not yourself.
Absolutely. And as you're saying that, and I'm thinking of our women in midlife, and I'm in this
Yeah.
age group as well. And when you talk about those roles and the
Mm-hmm.
roles that they have played throughout life,
Mm-hmm.
they were the
Mm-hmm.
kid, and then they were the
Yeah.
wife or the spouse or the partner, and then the mom, and then the career
Yeah.
person or business
Mm-hmm.
owner, and all of these roles. And I think when we get into our late 30s, 40s, and 50s, it kind of
Mm-hmm.
feels like those roles are really starting to collide in a big
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
collisional way.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
it feels
Mm-hmm.
like for many of the women that I work with, there's this coming to the surface of,
Mm, mhm,
I
mhm,
don't know how I identify with this role anymore. I don't know if I want that
mhm,
role anymore.
mhm, mhm,
I'm trying to identify with that who I am, and maybe
mhm,
this new
mhm,
who I am, like we said, this new
mhm,
becoming that someone might be
mhm,
moving into.
mm,
So
mhm.
there's a bit of a shifting between, like, being themselves to feeling emotionally
Yeah.
free. How they felt maybe emotionally free in their 20s is now feeling very different to being emotionally
Yes.
free in our 40s and 50s.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think for many of us, as our years go on, and we're lucky to live those years, but the roles compile, right? There becomes role upon role upon role. Whereas when you're young and perhaps single and maybe not working a job that has as much responsibility as you might work later, it can feel more accessible to feel emotionally free, and the roles begin to feel heavy, right? And they should, because they're important. But I think what happens sometimes is that we lose ourself as separate from the roles, right? And then we wake up and find ourselves as just as the role and not as a separate self. And that, I think, can be some of the unbecoming and the becoming and the awakening, right? Or this coming to the surface. That, I love that phrase that you used.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of what perimenopause is all about, is this
Yeah.
resurfacing that's starting to happen. And, as I
Mm-hmm.
was reading through your work, and I was having a lot of thoughts around, body image too,
Mm-hmm.
and that, how much of those roles that
Mm-hmm.
women have had over the years
Mm-hmm.
have then taught them a narrative of how their body is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to show up for that role. And the
Yeah.
main
Wow.
dominant one is thinness,
Mm-hmm.
attractiveness,
Mm-hmm.
increasingly like fitness, or what does a fit body
Mm-hmm.
look like? What does a healthy body look like? They all eventually lead
Mm-hmm.
back to thinness. But
Mm-hmm.
so then there can be this collision too of, that trying to feel into yourself
Mm-hmm.
as a separate being, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
But then if the
Mm-hmm.
person is also having a hard time identifying, like, with their body, especially in perimenopause, when we start to see weight gain happening, and
Mm-hmm.
now that, like, physical image of
Mm-hmm.
themselves, they're having
Yeah.
a hard time identifying with
Yeah.
that too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think oftentimes we're taught as women to get our worth from our physical image. And so if that begins to change, that then that can bring up questions of worth, that of course we disagree with, but I think that that's an important thing that happens and that I see happen.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
we can disagree with it all we want to. The reality is, the
Mhm.
cultural messaging is set up a certain way.
Sure. Oh yeah,
And so
100%.
there's this, like,
Mhm.
the holding space for both. We don't have to
Mhm.
agree
Mhm.
with it, but we also have to
Mhm.
recognize that it is there. And so how are we
It's
going to
real.
take care of
Mhm.
ourselves in the process
Mhm.
of it being there?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mhm.
Kind of along those lines, I think there was a quote, I believe it's on your
Mhm.
website, that says, "We
Mhm.
are all in the process of becoming more or less, or something of something,
Mhm.
becoming ourselves." And
Mhm.
can you explain a little bit how you
Mhm.
help your clients navigate this process or journey of becoming? And let's
Mhm.
just use it as an example of,
Mhm.
a woman that is in her early 40s, and now this
Mhm.
shift is starting to happen. What might
Mhm.
that look
Mhm.
like for
Mhm.
her?
Yeah, yeah. A woman in her early 40s, perhaps if she's a mother, having more time for herself that she didn't have before. If she's not a mother, perhaps having more financial freedom than she did in years before, to have space for herself. And I think that, we kind of, at least the way I was raised, I think that sometimes it's like you're going to get to an arrival point, and then you've arrived, and then what do you do? Right? And this idea of becoming is that we're always in the process. I see it as very freeing. And so for a woman in her 40s, what are the things that you have not made space for in the years before? That because your roles or your position in life didn't allow for it, right? Or because you, as you have gotten older, have started to give yourself just more permission to be more authentically yourself. So I think becoming in some ways is making space, and part of that is making space by becoming less of other things, less people pleasing, less oriented towards putting our worth in certain outside things, making more space for who we actually are and what we actually want to do, whether that's a going back to school, changing careers, whether that's learning to bake, or to learning to, do a new thing actively outside. It could be anything.
And I think the key word to what you said there too is permission. I think that's
Yes.
where we
Mm-hmm.
get stuck a lot, because we
Yeah.
might be in
Yeah.
that space of life. Like you said, we either have more financial freedom, or we might have
Yeah.
time. And
Mm-hmm.
when a woman has been in this other space of not the
Mm-hmm.
time, not the financial freedom,
Yeah.
and then what stories get crafted around
Mm-hmm.
that need to be
Mm-hmm.
unpacked, to allow
Mm-hmm.
herself permission and an awareness of
Yes.
saying, like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have to do that anymore. You're
Right.
coming into a
Right.
different time in your life. You have
Mm-hmm.
permission to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
do what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I so agree with that. And I think that there's something to coming into your 40s where, sort of the old things that you tried or felt like you needed to try to get approval just ring a little more hollow. If we're lucky enough to live into our 40s, it just rings hollow. It's like, well, sure, I tried that, and it didn't ever satisfy as deeply as it was sold to or I believed it would. So I think that can be sort of part of the freedom too that women can move into. As the old ways of getting approval just aren't as attractive anymore, which leaves more space for being more yourself and giving yourself that permission.
And that word satisfaction is
Yeah.
so key
Yeah.
to my work, whether we're talking about finding satisfaction with food and what does that
Mm-hmm.
even mean for someone.
Yeah.
And as we do maybe that really tangible work with finding it with food, all of a sudden I see my clients going, I don't really like that form of movement. I would rather go
Mm-hmm.
do this for a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather go
Right.
do this. I'm like, oh, isn't that
Mm-hmm.
interesting that this
Mm-hmm.
satisfaction, it's just starting to trickle into so many
Mm.
other aspects of our
I
life,
love
like you
that.
said, especially in our
Mm-hmm.
40s. And I
Mm-hmm.
love how you said,
Absolutely.
like, maybe what we did in the past feels
Mm-hmm.
hollow. I
Yeah.
just was
Mm-hmm.
thinking of like my interaction with social media of late, like talk
Mm-hmm.
about hollow.
Yes.
I'm
So
starting to
true.
pull back
It
a
is a
little
hollow
bit.
place.
I'm
Yes.
like,
Yes.
it's just not,
Absolutely.
it's not,
Mm-hmm.
it's a great place to connect with colleagues and I'm grateful for
Yeah.
that, but
Sure.
it's not feeling the same way or as
Mm-hmm.
exciting as,
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
when I first started
Mm-hmm.
using it. And so
Yeah.
that
Mm-hmm.
hollowness has a really great description for
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Not as
Yep. Yes.
satisfying, hollow, not
Yes.
as
Yes.
fulfilling.
Right, right. And I think sometimes things that could be a tool, we're taught to have them as satisfying, And I think that that's where we can often get confused, whatever it is, whether it's a job or, a social media or something, those things are tools that can be good, but they aren't meant to satisfy, but we're kind of set up to believe they are. And, and they're set up to work in our brains in a way that hits those points.
Absolutely. And just as you were saying that, I'm thinking about like what we're taught about food, like diet versions of
Yeah.
food. Like, no, rice
Mm-hmm.
cakes are satisfying. You really think they're
Right.
satisfying with nothing
Right.
on them,
Uh-huh.
no peanut
Right.
butter, no
Right.
avocado.
Right.
They're satisfying.
Right.
You
Right.
like that, right? All the powders and all of that. It's another area that we're taught
It's
like,
so
no,
true.
you really
Mm-hmm.
like the diet version of this, don't you?
You're
Really?
so right. Yeah. That's so true. It's so true. Uh-huh.
Well, I love all the writing that you do, and you've done a number of
Mm-hmm.
really great pieces for some publications. And there was an article that you wrote for Darling, and
Uh-huh.
one of the pieces that stood out to me is when I stopped seeking attention from someone who didn't deserve it. And I went, oh, hold the phone. Like, we got to
Mm-hmm.
unpack this a little bit. And I'd
Mm-hmm.
love to
Yeah.
explore that from maybe the perspective of dieting or diet
Mm-hmm.
culture, maybe that being the inattentive boyfriend. So the article goes on
Mm-hmm.
to kind of be talking about
Mm-hmm.
a personal relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
here's just a snippet of a quote from the
Mm-hmm.
article that we can tie into this relationship with food and body piece. You wrote,
Mm-hmm.
"What I wish I would have known then is that love is not the same as earning something. I wish I had
Mm.
known that anyone who sets it up that way for you should not be invited in. No, love is
Mm.
more like a homecoming, and that
Mm.
homecoming starts with you. The
Mm.
locks you are carrying around unexamined may look as if they are waiting for the keys of someone else to unlock them and affirm you. As you learn to recognize, know, and love yourself, the availability of someone else's games will start to change. The change
Mm-hmm.
starts with your locks, not their key."
Mm.
Wow. I had to reread that a
Yeah.
few times. I thought,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much to this, and kind of just what
Yeah.
we were just saying, like a bit of
Mm-hmm.
that, what is really satisfying to you,
Mm-hmm.
either
Mm-hmm.
in the aspect of love, in the aspect of relationships that you want to engage in. So
Mm-hmm.
let's unpack that quote a little bit. If you
Yeah.
remember the place of what you were coming from as you were writing that or writing that article, I'd love to hear
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, I mean it is from a personal story where I learned that lesson relationally, but I think you're so right that it whether it's an inattentive boyfriend literally or metaphorically of what we've been taught to get approval from. We kind of wait and work so hard to get that approval from something or someone. And I think real freedom is recognizing, you know, even if you had gotten that approval that you were working so hard to get, it wouldn't have ever satisfied. And that real freedom is you coming home to yourself and determining that. So, which is, I always think of, becoming ourselves or that kind of emotional freedom, whether it's from diet culture or a relationship, as a homecoming, because we're pretty great places to be, but we're often taught that we're not. And so we go on these long journeys of approval from a partner or approval from, looking a certain way, and they just don't ever satisfy. I think a lot of emotional freedom, full circle, is just that, that coming home to yourself and like, wow, I like it here.
Yeah. When I was reading that quote, the way that it struck me with the diet culture piece is, and
Mm-hmm.
using that as almost the analogy for the boyfriend too is that, so
Mm-hmm.
even though if there isn't a specific person there, but how often
Mm-hmm.
women in our 20s and maybe even into 30s, teens, 20s, 30s,
Yeah.
we get this idea of even if I'm not trying to achieve love and belonging with one specific person, I'm trying to do it with the culture at large. And
Yeah.
so I'm taught that
Yes.
if I am smaller, or smaller means healthier,
Mm-hmm.
and all of these, again, it's those narratives again that start to get
Mm-hmm.
wrapped up in all of this, and it
Yes.
starts to create those
Mm-hmm.
locks, those locks on
Yes.
who we were really meant to be and how we were really meant to
Mm.
show up in the world. And we keep
Mm-hmm.
looking to diet
Mm-hmm.
culture, to maybe it ends up being eventually an individual person to unlock.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, here I am. I
Yeah.
played the game.
Yeah.
I did all the
Right.
things that I was
Right.
supposed to do. Now
Right.
you're going to
Mm-hmm.
unlock me, right?
Right. Right. Isn't this how this goes? Right. Yeah.
Right,
Uh-huh.
because that's the
Yeah.
story that we're
It
taught.
is.
And yet,
Mm-hmm.
when that doesn't happen, because even if
Mm-hmm.
someone, the other part of the lock part is, even if someone, say their body did change, they did lose a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
weight by playing the
Sure.
game, and then they started
Mm-hmm.
to get the validation in a way that validation is then getting unlocked. They're thinking like,
Yeah.
okay, I've
Mm-hmm.
arrived. I'm in this
Yeah.
smaller
Right.
body and I'm getting all
Mm-hmm.
of the validation. Sweet. Like, here it
Mm-hmm.
is. But like
Mm-hmm.
you said, it's not fully satisfying. And
Yeah.
as we know from the research on, dieting research, it's short
Mm-hmm.
lived, 2 years at the
Mm-hmm.
most, but anywhere from two to
Mm-hmm.
5 years, people start
Yeah.
gaining the weight back again. So that's what
Mm-hmm.
really struck me too, is this analogy of what you wrote, in that how much is our culture that
Mm-hmm.
larger piece of
Yeah.
creating
Mm-hmm.
these locks, and it's not going to unlock it for us, if
Mm-hmm.
even if we keep
Mm-hmm.
playing, or it's going to
Yes.
unlock it but for a short
Yes.
period of time.
Right. It won't satisfy. Back to your word, it won't really satisfy you, even if you do win the game, right? Or even if you win the approval. It won't ultimately satisfy, and it's short lived. Absolutely. Hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to put a link to that article in our show
Okay,
notes
great.
today, and that's
Yeah,
just, I think that will ring true for a lot of
great.
people and a lot of ahas, and especially those of us in
Hmm.
midlife. Like, we've had a few of those
Hmm.
relationships over the years, and
Sure.
so we can
Yes,
identify with
yes,
like, oh, that's what this
yes.
was,
Hmm.
aside from our
Hmm.
dieting journey too.
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
So, Monica, I'm wondering if you have maybe like 3 tips, strategies, ideas to kind of leave us with, and women in midlife with, of what are some of the first steps that someone could take
Hmm.
towards working on unbecoming and then becoming this new midlife version of
Mm.
themselves?
Yeah. I would say the first one would be validation. You talked about awareness. I think that validation is one of the most essential tools to becoming ourselves, and it's free, it's accessible. We can do it for ourselves and we can do it for each other. I feel like it's one of the most underestimated things. And basically, validation is, I'm listening to you. You say this to yourself. You make sense. Your feelings matter. What happened was not okay, or it's okay that you didn't like it. That you make sense. And I think when we start to do that for ourselves, we automatically create more self compassion. We create more awareness. We create more space internally and emotionally. So I would say the first step is validation. And then the second step, sort of the unbecoming, is what doesn't work for you? What is not working? And this can be as simple as, well, I don't like this wake up time in the morning, or it can be as deep as, I don't like feeling anxious every time I leave a dinner with people and rehashing what I said. I don't like that. Starting to really, after validating who you are and just what's not working, what doesn't feel good anymore, and what am I tolerating? Trying to get someone's approval, or overworking myself while my coworkers, take vacation, right? What's not working? And then what do you want? And this again is as tiny as, I want a sandwich. or as big as, right?
Yeah.
I want to be a writer. Like, I don't know what it might be for you, but I think the best place to start with that is small. Someone says, do you want to go to this restaurant? No, I don't want that. This is what I want. As small as that, I think as women, we're often not taught to listen to that want, and so what do I want? That would be the three things, validating yourself. What's not working? What do I want?
Yes. Yeah, I've heard versions of those. One, they've come
Mm-hmm.
up in my work. I've heard them from other colleagues
Yeah.
too. And I think, they could almost be our anthem for midlife or something. Like there's this so
Yes,
important because
absolutely.
we've spent decades of not feeling
Mm-hmm.
validated either by
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, by the people around us,
Mm-hmm.
by our culture. We've
Mm-hmm.
not been taught how to ask for what
Yeah.
we want and not feel
Mm-hmm.
like we're being the bitch or
Right.
we're being
Totally. Mm-hmm.
selfish. And so
Or
there's,
entitled or demanding. Mm-hmm.
yes, all those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So
Mm-hmm.
learning that skill of how do I ask for what I want in a self-compassionate way and a compassionate way
Yeah.
towards the person who I'm asking it for.
Yeah.
And you're right, starting small, like starting with the food, starting with the
Mm-hmm.
clothes. What clothes
Yeah.
do you actually want to wear? Are you wearing them
Right.
because someone else thought you should wear them? Or are they
Yes.
actually comfortable
Mm-hmm.
for your
Mm-hmm.
person and your style and all of that? Yes, starting
100%.
small. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this conversation has been wonderful, as I knew it would be. And one of the things that where I want to steer people towards is
Yeah.
following you on social media, following you on Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
because you have your
Yeah.
lives that you do, your short little videos that are all kind of
Mm-hmm.
centered around this, I think are
Yeah.
really great nuggets, food for thought for people to just
Mm-hmm.
take on into their day or do some journal reflecting
Yeah.
on. So we'll put links to that in the show notes. Is
Great.
there any place else,
Thank you.
Monica, that you'd like to send people to learn more about your work?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, definitely social media, Monica DiCristina. And then my podcast is still becoming, speaking of the becoming word, I obviously love it. And then a project that I'm doing is the Here app. And so that's on social media as well. You can go there, but it's an app with 2 minutes a day on one topic a month. So it's just mindful and grounding and calming. Um, and all the links to that are in my social media because the app store is difficult to navigate when you're using common words like here. So I would just go to the direct link.
Perfect. Well, we will add all of
Yeah.
that to the show
Thank
notes. And yeah, it's been wonderful to meet you. And again, thank you for your time and being here.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our time together.